G'day viewers. In this segment we'll talk about the history of the internet. We'll cover many different internet protocols during this course, but before we get there I'd just like to tell you something about where the internet's come from, so you have some context. So this slide gives you a rough timeline for the development of the internet. We've already talked about the internet as being an astounding artifact that these days has more than 1 billion nodes, so it connects to a significant fraction of the planet. It also has tremendous social and economic impacts on the world today. This graph shows something about where it came from. Now, the history of the internet is obviously very rich, but if I had to boil it down into a capsule summary for this lecture, I would pick just 3 phases. The first phase is the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet where it all began. The second phase in the middle is the NSFNet, where NSF stands for National Science Foundation. This is really a period in which the internet grew up. And the third phase is what we just might think of as the modern internet and web, where the internet emerges in a form which is much closer to the one we know today. As you can see, this progression took place over, 40 years. So each of these phases lasts more than a decade. And there is a tremendous amount of growth here too as we go up. You can see in each of these phases, the size of the internet is increased by roughly a factor of 1,000. These are obviously very rough numbers, so take any exact numbers here with a grain of salt, but it should give you a sense of how the internet's developed. In the beginning phase, the internet was actually not the internet at all. It was an earlier network called the ARPANET. The ARPANET was a US DoD network. It was originally motivated by the need for resource sharing. At this time, computers were large facilities that existed in a room, and if you wanted to share it amongst a group of people who were widely separated, a network was a great idea to do it. The early ARPANET started with just 4 nodes in 1969. It connected together some sites and sent packets, so it was a very modest experimental facility. Nonetheless, it was quite exciting. It was revolutionary in some ways for the time, and it began to grow very quickly. Interestingly, you might know this, but one of the killer apps, actually the first killer app of the internet, was really email. This was not an originally envisioned usage, but it quickly grew to become a very popular form of using the internet. There are 2 really key influences in this period during the 60s before the ARPANET was constructed. One of these was packet switching, which was pioneered by Len Kleinrock of UCLA with much of his theoretical work, and Donald Davies of England with some prototype networks. Packet switching is very different than circuit switching that's used in the telephone network. Telephone networks were the kind of network that existed before the internet. Data traffic is very bursty. So if you send packets over a telephone line, you don't tend to use that line very well. Packet switching was a new kind of way of using the network in which different users would all share the same bandwidth, and they would just get to use it whenever they sent packets. And some of this early work suggested it would be a good way to design networks. So that was one key influence. The other early influence was Paul Barron at RAND, who came up with designs for a network that had really very decentralized control structures. This is where some of the lines about the internet surviving nuclear attacks came from. In this new architecture, since it was decentralized, if you knocked out any portion of it, the rest of it would just keep on going on. This figure here shows the geographical map for the ARPANET. This is in December 1968. And so that's almost 10 years after the ARPANET has started. You can see that it's grown significantly. It's now dozens of nodes scattered across the United States. It's a fairly modest network by modern standards. You can see here the links. They run at 56 kilobits per second. It was fast at the time. That's now the speed of a slow computer modem using the telephone. And these nodes, many of these nodes were called IMPs. And they are the precursors. They're the earliest form of routers. So this is what the network looked like. In the second phase, the NSFNet emerged, and the internet really began to grow up into a more recognizable form. After the ARPANET, there was a lot of excitement around packet switch networks, and many similar networks began to appear, but they mostly served separate communities or they were for particular purposes. The NSFNet, which started in '85, broadly supported the educational community and allowed many of these different networks to be connected. Originally, the NSFNet was to provide access to different supercomputer sites for the academic community. But soon, because of its policy of allowing anyone at an academic institution to connect, it became the backbone for the internet, which is, some of the key glue which held together connectivity between different portions of the internet. It's during this phase of the internet that the classic protocols that we know today emerged. For instance, TCP/IP in its modern form was deployed in, I think, 1983. It was a flag day, one of the last flag days, when the protocols in the ARPANET switched from earlier protocols, NCP to TCP/IP. The DNS, the Domain Name System, which we use for distributed administration of names, emerged in 1983 also. Before that, it was just a table, a flat table stored on a computer. And also Berkeley sockets. The API we talked about and saw earlier emerged in 1983. It proliferated in 1983 with the deployment of the BSD 4.2 Unix. Work on internet routing schemes also evolved, and BGP, which is the main internet routing protocol used across organizations, began to be prototyped, and by 1993 it was in widespread use in the internet. This is really a period of growth. It's somewhat different than today if you just cast your mind back to what existed during the 80s, not the modern computers we have today. In fact, much of the growth came from early forms of the personal computer as they took off and people began to, in fact, buy computers and they would connect them to the internet. Ethernet LANs, or local area networks, really began to take off in this period too. Ethernet, the most popular form of local area network today, actually maybe wireless is today, but the most popular wired form, was invented by Bob Metcalfe in the early 70s, about 73. But it wasn't until the 80s that it really began to take off. Ethernet was used in campuses to connect together all of the machines in a department, and then in companies to connect all of their computers together, and eventually at home. So there was really a lot of growth during this period, and by 1993 you can see there were more than 1 million hosts in the internet. Here's a picture of the early internet architecture with the NSFNet. The feature I'd point out to you is that it's quite simple. It's a hierarchical structure, and the way routing worked is you just routed as high up as you needed to reach the destination. So these customer networks might be at a local university, and if you wanted to talk to another university, well, these customer networks were connected to regional networks, which in turn were connected to the NSFNet as the backbone network. If you wanted to send a message between computers, you might send a message up through the regional network down to another university. If you had to go a long distance, your packet might be routed up to the backbone, and from the backbone down to another university over the other side of the country. So it was a fairly simple architecture. The growth in the size of the network is also reflected in the growth of the networking technologies, the speed at which individual links run. You can see here that the links of the network started at 56 kilobits per second when it was first commissioned in 1985. They rose 3 years later. They were replaced with 1.5 megabit per second links. And then only 3 years later again, 45 megabit per second links were folded into the backbone. So this is 3 orders of magnitude increase in speed in 6 years. The internet was really moving along. And that brings us to the final phase of growth, the modern internet and the birth of the web, which is much closer to the internet as we know it. If I just had to pick 2 changes which summarize this sort of phase, I would pick a change in the architecture and the birth of the web. The change in the architecture is that after 1985, there was no single NSFNet backbone. With a great deal of foresight, the NSF, when they retired their network, they replaced the backbone of the internet with a structure by which large ISPs could compete with one another to carry traffic from different organizations. So this really got the internet off on a commercial footing. Of course, if your customer networks connect to different ISPs, you need to be able to get traffic between them. if your customers are on different ISPs. And so all of these large transit ISPs connected at what is called internet exchange points, facilities for interconnection. And much later on, the large content providers emerged, such as Google these days, or Netflix, something like that. The web also burst onto the scene, which changed our usage in '93. And it really took off quite quickly. Its growth stressed the internet and led to the development of content distribution networks, as well as ICANN, which is a body to control the naming and use of the internet. Naming became very controversial, as everyone went after different domain names. Now, as we've grown, most of our content is actually video, the majority of bytes are video, and we're very close to the majority of bytes coming from wireless devices on the edge. So content is very much driving the internet. And here, finally, is a diagram of the internet architecture, the modern internet architecture. This is really to contrast with the earlier diagram. You can see that it's different in a couple of key respects. The main one is there's no longer a single backbone. There is instead these parallel transit networks which are providing connectivity. So if we want to send a packet between one customer and another, it may well be the case that the different customers will be on different transit ISPs. Let me just pick a couple of customers. Let's just say this customer and this customer on either end. So the different transit ISPs are connected at facilities called internet exchange points. That means that a packet that's been routed through the internet might go something like this. It might go up to this transit ISP because it's got to get to the customer somehow, then out through an IXP, from that IXP to another transit ISP, might be carried over the transit ISP, and then down to the customer. This, I'm trying to draw this going behind, because all of these transit ISPs exist in parallel. The other difference is that there are now also content providers. These content providers might source a movie which might go over the IXP to a transit network and down to another customer. Yeah, I'll arrow that way. So the internet has gotten a lot more complex in terms of the many business arrangements which affect the flow of traffic, the connectivity between things. In other respects, it's really quite similar. It's still quite decentralized. All of these different networks are operated independently and they can run largely without one another beyond an initial step of simply registering identifiers to get going and owning your internet address space.